My name is Paige Warren. I'm 29 years old, and 3 weeks ago my mother defended my sister after she stole every dollar I had saved over 3 brutal years of overnight shifts, double weekends, and holidays spent in a veterinary ER while other people were home eating cake. I didn't lose that money in some scam. I lost it in my own kitchen, with my mother standing there telling me to calm down while my sister leaned against the counter with that lazy little smile and said, "I can do whatever I want in this house." I still remember the way her voice sounded when she said it. Not angry, not scared. Certain, like she had already won, because in our family she usually did. I packed my scrubs, my laptop, and a duffel bag that same night and walked out without giving either of them the scene they wanted. 3 weeks later, I came back. My sister was still smirking. My mother was still acting like I was the unreasonable one. And then the front door flew open, heavy footsteps hit the hallway, and the look on my sister's face finally changed. That was the moment I learned something I should have understood years earlier. People can laugh at your pain for a very long time when they think there will never be consequences. But once consequences walk through the door wearing badges, all that confidence dies fast. Before I tell you exactly what happened in that house, tell me this. What time is it where you are right now, and where are you watching from? I want to know how far this story travels before it reaches the part my family wishes nobody ever heard. 3 years before that night, I made a promise to myself in the fluorescent break room of Brookside Veterinary Emergency, the animal hospital where I worked nights outside Tulsa. I was exhausted, covered in fur and antiseptic, and eating pretzels out of a vending machine because I was trying not to spend money on anything I didn't absolutely need. I opened my banking app, transferred another small piece of my paycheck into a high-yield savings account, and labeled the folder Condo Fund. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I had spent most of my 20s helping other people survive crises, stabilizing panicked pet owners, holding oxygen masks over trembling dogs, comforting families at 3 in the morning while they cried into my scrub sleeve. I wanted something solid of my own, a small condo, my own front door, my own kitchen. No family drama, no borrowed space, no one treating my room like temporary storage for their chaos. My younger sister Lacey thought all of that was hilarious. Lacey never held a job longer than a season, but somehow always had a new phone, a fresh manicure, and enough money for concert tickets, girls' trips, and whatever social media hobby she was pretending was a business that month. My mother Diane called her spirited. I called her expensive. At first, the thefts were small enough to make me doubt myself. $30? $80. A payment I didn't remember authorizing. I blamed autopay, a subscription, my own exhaustion. Overnight work messes with your head, and mine was always foggy after back-to-back 12-hour shifts. But then I came home one Thursday morning after helping intubate a pit bull with heat stroke, sat at the kitchen table, opened my account, and felt every bit of blood drain from my face. $17,460 was gone. Not reduced. Gone. Wire transferred out in chunks over 8 days. I thought there had to be some mistake so huge it would correct itself if I stared long enough. Instead, I heard Lacey coming down the hallway, humming to herself in brand new boots I knew she hadn't paid for. When I asked Diane if she had seen my debit card, she didn't even look surprised. She just dried her hands and said, "Why are you making that face?" Like she already knew the answer and was buying time. I confronted Lacey in front of both of them. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I laid my phone on the counter, showed the transfer history, and asked one simple question. "Where is my money?" Lacey looked at the screen, then at me, then gave me this slow, smug shrug that made something inside me go white hot. "Maybe you should have paid more attention to your own account," she said. I asked Diane if she had my back, if she had known, if she had seen anything. She crossed her arms and hit me with the same line she'd used since I was a teenager. You two need to stop turning everything into a war. A war. That's what she called my savings disappearing. When I pushed harder, Lacey rolled her eyes and said the sentence I will probably hear in my head for the rest of my life. I can do whatever I want in this house. Not, I borrowed it. Not, I'll pay you back. Whatever I want. And the worst part was, Diane didn't correct her. She just told me to lower my voice because the neighbors might hear. That night was Lacey's birthday dinner. Balloons in the dining room, a cake on the counter, her friends drifting in and out of the living room, while I stood upstairs trying not to shake. I had proof on my phone, but proof means very little when the people closest to you have already decided your pain is inconvenient. I came downstairs anyway. I called her out in front of everyone. I said she had stolen from me, that my mother had protected her, that I was done being treated like the family workhorse whose life could be raided whenever Lacey wanted something shiny. Lacey laughed. One of her friends laughed too, then stopped when she realized I wasn't joking. Diane snapped at me for ruining the celebration. Not for the theft. For the timing. You're being selfish, she said, loud enough to silence the room. Your sister is celebrating. That was the moment I knew the truth wasn't going to save me in that house. It was only going to humiliate me if I stayed there long enough for them to twist it. So I went upstairs, packed a duffel, took my documents, my work shoes, and the small lockbox key I kept hidden in an old sock, and came back down. Diane told me not to be dramatic. Lacey laughed and said, "Ha ha ha, good luck out there." I looked at both of them, opened the front door, and left without another word. I drove straight to Hannah Mercer's apartment on the north side of town. Hannah and I had known each other since community college, before life split us into different kinds of adulthood. She worked as a radiology tech, lived alone in a cramped but clean second-floor place, and had the kind of calm face that made people tell her the truth even when they hadn't planned to. When she opened the door and saw my bag, she didn't ask me whether I was overreacting. She just moved aside and said, "Guest room's yours. Start talking when you're ready." I sat on the edge of her bed and told her everything, from the missing transfers to Diane defending Lacey in front of half the neighborhood. Hannah didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she only asked one question. "How did your sister move that much money without your authorization?" That question changed everything, because up to that point I had been drowning in betrayal, not thinking like a woman whose life had just been financially violated. The next morning, while the anger was still fresh, I called my bank's fraud department. Within 20 minutes, I learned something that made the whole mess uglier. The wire transfers hadn't come from a stolen card number or some hacker in another state. They were processed through in-person verification and one log device that had once been attached to my old family plan. Someone had my PIN. Someone had used personal verification answers only family would know. Someone had also attempted to add a secondary contact email to the account 2 weeks earlier. That email belonged to Lacey. Once I heard that, the story stopped being family drama and became a crime with paperwork attached. The fraud investigator told me to freeze the account, file a formal report, and gather any proof of unauthorized access. So I did. I changed every password, pulled my credit, and started making a timeline. Shift schedules, transfer dates, times I had been at work while money was moving. Texts from Lacey bragging about shopping. Screenshots of Diane telling me to stop being so intense over money. A bank employee also flagged surveillance from one transfer made in person. They couldn't release it to me directly, but they could preserve it for law enforcement. Suddenly, I wasn't just hurt. I was building a case. Hannah became the first person to say what my own mother refused to say. "Paige, this is theft. Maybe more than theft." That maybe got bigger when I checked my email and found a digital receipt for a luxury furniture deposit made with my account details the day after one of the larger transfers. Lacey had apparently put money down on a boutique studio space she wanted to rent for her newest idea, some half-baked online styling business she had been selling to Diane as her breakthrough. By the end of week 1, I had enough to understand the shape of what happened. Lacey had been quietly draining my savings to finance a fake grown-up life. Diane had known pieces of it and chosen not to know the rest. That was how she always operated with Lacey. She called it love when it was really cowardice in a mother's clothing. Still, for 2 solid days, I almost backed down. Not because I doubted the facts, but because I knew exactly what would happen once police got involved. Family lines would harden, relatives would turn into jurors, Diane would cry, Lacey would lie. I would become the cold one, the disloyal one, the daughter who brought officers to her mother's door. That idea sat like lead in my stomach. Hannah found me on her balcony one night staring at my phone and asked me the question nobody in my family had ever asked with any honesty. If this had happened to someone you loved, would you tell her to keep quiet because the thief shares her last name? I answered immediately. No. That answer embarrassed me, because it meant I already knew the right thing and had been waiting for permission to do it. So I stopped waiting. I filed the police report on a Monday morning in a beige interview room that smelled like old coffee and printer toner. The detective assigned to financial crimes was a woman named Detective Elaine Porter. She didn't give me the fake sympathy voice people use when they think family betrayal is too awkward to touch. She was practical, clear, exact. She asked for statements, screenshots, employment records, login alerts, anything that established I wasn't present when the transfers happened. When I mentioned my mother defending my sister and insisting it was just a misunderstanding, Porter looked up and said, "Misunderstandings usually don't need forged access credentials." That sentence hit me hard because it was the first time an authority figure had spoken about my situation without minimizing it. As more evidence came in, the picture got worse. One transfer had been approved through a device registered to my mother's home Wi-Fi, another linked to a purchase under Lacey's name. There was enough for Detective Porter to request a warrant for financial records and in-home evidence recovery, but she warned me not to celebrate too early. "These cases move fast once the paper trail gets clean," she said, "but families make them messy." She was right. The mess started almost immediately. Word must have gotten around from the bank because Diane called me the next day from a number I hadn't blocked yet. She started with tears and ended with fury. She said I was humiliating my own family, that I was willing to destroy Lacey's life over money, that sisters fight and move on. I asked her one question. "Did you know she was using my savings?" Diane didn't answer directly. She said Lacey was under stress, that I had no idea what pressure looked like for creative people, and that I should be asking why my sister felt desperate, not acting like a victim. That was all I needed to hear. I stopped trying to win an emotional argument with people who had already made me the villain in theirs. Instead, I focused on facts. I gave Detective Porter the call log, the voicemail, the texts. By week 2, she had enough to tell me, "We're close." By week 3, she asked if I'd be willing to come home one more time when the warrant was ready, because suspects talk more freely before they realize law enforcement is already in the driveway. That was when I agreed to go back. The morning I went back, I didn't feel brave. I felt cold, controlled. Like I had packed all my fear into a box and locked it somewhere behind my ribs just to get through the drive. Hannah offered to come with me, but Detective Porter told me it would be cleaner if I arrived first under a believable reason. So I did what women like me have always done in bad family situations. I made myself useful. I texted Diane and said I was coming by to pick up the rest of my papers and some work equipment I'd left in the hall closet. She replied after 40 minutes with, "Fine. Come get your things and let's end this circus." Lacey texted separately, "Hope you learned your lesson." I almost laughed at that. I wasn't the one who needed a lesson anymore. The house looked exactly the same when I pulled into the driveway, which somehow made it worse. Same planters? Same faded porch rug. Same family mailbox with Warren printed across the side like the word still meant safety. I sat in my car for a full 30 seconds before getting out. I could hear music inside. Not party music this time, just the ordinary soundtrack of people who think they've gotten away with something. Diane opened the door before I knocked, already annoyed, already prepared to be righteous. She took one look at me and said, "Well, at least you decided to stop hiding." I walked past her and smelled vanilla candles and lemon cleaner, the same house smell from my childhood. And for one disorienting second, I remembered being 11 years old in that hallway, carrying a stray kitten inside my hoodie because I thought Mom would help me save it. That memory almost cracked me. Then Lacey came around the corner in yoga pants and glossy lip balm, saw me, and smirked. "Haha, the failure came back," she said. There it was. Not fear, not regret. Mockery. She really believed she had outrun this. Diane told her to stop, but it wasn't a real correction. It was the same weak little performance she always put on when Lacey said something cruel in front of company. I set my keys on the side table and said I was only there for my documents. Lacey leaned against the wall and folded her arms like she was settling in for a show. "You know what's funny?" she said. "You running off like some tragic little saint over money you were just going to waste on a boring condo anyway." Diane made a face, half warning, half pleading, but still didn't say the one sentence that mattered. "You stole from her." Instead, she looked at me and said, "Paige, if you came here to start trouble again, leave. Again." As if trouble had walked in with me instead of having slept in my old bedroom for 26 years. I asked one last question, not because I needed the answer, but because I wanted them to say it out loud before the door opened. "Lacey, did you take my savings?" She looked straight at me and laughed. "You act like I robbed a bank," she said. "It was family money in a family house, and you weren't using it fast enough." Diane shut her eyes for a second, and even then she didn't deny it. She just whispered, "Lacey," like tone alone could erase a confession. I remember that moment with painful clarity, the hallway light, the hum of the refrigerator, the little click of Diane's bracelet when her hand trembled. I also remember the strange calm that washed over me when I realized I was done hoping. Done hoping Diane would suddenly become a mother worth protecting. Done hoping Lacey would grow a conscience because I looked hurt enough. You can survive a lot once hope finally dies. That was the point where my fear turned into something cleaner. I bent down, picked up the folder of documents I'd left by the door, and Lacey laughed again. "That's it?" she said. "You came all the way back for papers?" I looked at her and smiled, which made her expression flicker for the first time. "No," I said. "I came back because I wanted to see your face when it ended." She frowned, and at that exact second the front door burst open hard enough to slam against the wall. Heavy footsteps, male voices, a sharp command from the entryway. Diane spun so fast she nearly tripped on the rug. 2 uniformed officers came in first, then Detective Porter, then another officer carrying a folder and a body camera. The air in that hallway changed instantly. All the lazy arrogance Lacey had been wearing melted into disbelief. Diane rushed toward the entry like if she moved fast enough she could control the scene. "What's going on?" she cried. "What are you doing here?" Detective Porter held up the warrant and said the words that finally made the room feel real: financial theft, fraudulent access to protected funds, evidence recovery. Lacey actually looked at me then, not with superiority, not with mockery, but with the first honest flash of fear I had seen in her since childhood. That was when I said it. "Shh," I told them softly. "Don't panic. Just start praying. Everything after that happened fast and slow at the same time, the way shock warps time. One officer moved toward Lacey before she could bolt for the back of the house. Another stayed near Diane, who had gone from screaming to bargaining in less than 10 seconds. Detective Porter spoke directly to Lacey first, informing her that she was being detained while they executed the warrant and collected electronic devices, bank documents, transaction records, and any property purchased with stolen funds. Lacey started crying immediately, which would have meant more to me if I hadn't spent my whole life watching her weaponize tears whenever consequences got too close. She pointed at me and said, "She's lying. She's always been jealous." Porter didn't even glance my way. She asked Lacey if she wanted to revise the statement she made in my presence 30 seconds earlier about the money being family money. Lacey's mouth actually fell open. She looked at Diane, waiting for rescue the way she always had. Diane stepped in front of her like muscle memory. "She didn't understand," she said. "My daughters share things. Paige is unstable right now. She's exhausted. She works nights. She twists things." Porter's face never changed. "Good," she said. "Then you won't mind if we compare that to the bank footage and device logs." That line broke Diane faster than yelling would have. She went pale, the kind of pale people turn when they realize a lie they built an entire emotional defense around has already been disproven by paperwork. An officer went upstairs with Lacey to retrieve her phone, laptop, and the tablet linked to the transaction alerts. Another recovered a stack of boutique receipts from the dining room sideboard and a folder in Diane's desk with printed transfer confirmations. I watched my mother's face when one of those papers was placed in an evidence sleeve, not because I enjoyed it, but because I wanted to know when the truth finally reached her. I think it was then, not when I cried, not when I left, not when I called from Hannah's apartment. When a stranger in uniform sealed the lie in plastic, Diane finally understood that denial had limits. Lacey's bravado came back for a few jagged minutes once the handcuffs came out. She started shouting that I was ruining her future, that I wanted her in jail because I'd always hated watching her live bigger than me, that Mom had told her it would be fine. That sentence hung in the hallway like poison. Mom had told her it would be fine. Diane whipped her head around and hissed, "Lacey, stop talking." Too late. The officer nearest them looked at Detective Porter, and Porter's expression sharpened in a way I'll never forget. It was the look of a detective hearing accessory and knowledge slide casually into the open. Diane tried to backtrack, saying Lacey was emotional, that nobody meant anything literally. But if you've ever watched a case turn in real time, you know the feeling. The room got smaller. The silence got heavier. Even Lacey realized she had said too much. For once, her mouth had outrun the safety net. The search turned up more than my missing money. They found unopened credit offers in my name, one pre-filled application, and a sticky note with fragments of my old passwords in Diane's desk drawer. A purchase agreement for the studio Lacey wanted to rent was also recovered, along with a cashier's receipt showing part of the deposit came directly from the missing funds. Porter asked me to confirm several account numbers while the officers documented evidence. My voice didn't shake. That surprised me. I had imagined this moment for 3 sleepless weeks and thought I'd either collapse or explode. Instead, I felt oddly precise, like I was testifying in a language I knew better than pain. Facts can be a mercy when feelings become useless. Diane tried one final strategy after Lacey was led toward the door. She turned to me with tears running down her face and said, "Paige, please. Fix this. Tell them you don't want charges. Tell them we'll work it out at home." At home. That phrase nearly made me laugh. Home had been the place where my savings were looted while I worked overnights to afford a future. Home had been the place where my mother looked at theft and called it bad timing. I asked Diane the question that mattered most to me, even more than the money. "If I hadn't gone to the bank," I said, "would you ever have told me?" She didn't answer. That was enough. Detective Porter explained that the case was now in motion, that financial crimes involving documented fraudulent transfers did not disappear because the victim was pressured at the doorway. Lacey was taken out crying, mascara streaking down her face, neighbors already peeking through curtains because drama travels faster than truth in any suburb in America. Diane followed them onto the porch, yelling my name like I had abandoned her instead of the other way around. When the cars finally pulled away, the house went quiet in a way it never had before. Not peaceful, hollow. Diane came back inside and stood in the living room like someone had stolen the walls. She looked older in those 5 minutes than she had in the previous 10 years. I should tell you, I felt triumphant. I didn't. I felt finished. There's a difference. Triumph is hot. What I felt was cold, exact, and exhausted. I picked up the last of my paperwork, took the framed license from the hallway that had my name on it, and started toward the door. Diane said my name again, softer this time, not angry, begging. Please don't leave me alone in this. I stopped, but I didn't turn around right away. You left me alone the night you chose her over the truth, I said. This started then. Then I left. And this time when I walked out of that house, I wasn't the one losing anything. What came after the arrest wasn't one dramatic courtroom day. It was paperwork, interviews, statements, and the long, ugly process of consequences settling into places where excuses used to live. Detective Porter called me 2 days later to confirm that Lacey had been formally charged with fraud, theft, and unauthorized access to a protected financial account. Diane was not arrested that night, but she was under active investigation for obstruction and possible facilitation because of the device evidence, password fragments, and her statements. The bank's fraud department also completed its internal review and provisionally credited most of the stolen amount back to my account pending final adjudication. When I saw the balance restored, I cried harder than I had the night I left. Not because the number was back, but because for the first time in weeks, the world had answered me with something other than gaslighting. Diane started calling from borrowed numbers. She left voicemails in 3 different tones: rage, grief, and bargaining. In one, she said I had destroyed my sister's life over a temporary mistake. In another, she sobbed that she was losing both daughters at once. In another, she tried to sound practical, saying maybe I could tell the prosecutor I only wanted restitution, not jail time. That one told me everything. Even now, she still understood the situation as something I was doing to Lacey, not the natural outcome of what Lacey had done to me. I didn't answer any of them. My attorney, a quiet woman named Melissa Crow, recommended by Hannah's cousin, told me not to engage emotionally with people who were now part of an ongoing case. Silence is cleaner, she said. So I let silence do its work. Lacey, meanwhile, tried a different route through family friends and distant relatives who suddenly remembered I existed. One aunt wrote me a long message about Grace. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in 3 years said blood should matter more than money. It was almost impressive how quickly everyone found philosophy once it was my pain being offered up for group healing. Not one of them had called when I slept at Hannah's apartment with 1 duffel bag and $17,000 missing. But now that handcuffs had entered the chat, everybody discovered nuance. I ignored most of it. The only response I sent to anyone outside the case was simple. She did not steal from a stranger. She stole from her sister while our mother helped hide it. If that sentence sounded too ugly for them to sit with, that was not my problem anymore. About 10 days after the arrest, I met with the prosecutor's office. They asked whether I wanted to give a victim statement early, not for sentencing, but for charging context. I said yes. I told them the money itself mattered, of course. It represented 3 years of lost sleep, skipped vacations, and meals eaten from vending machines at 4 in the morning. But what mattered more was the pattern. Lacey had not acted impulsively once. She had accessed me repeatedly. She had enjoyed it. She had mocked me. Diane had chosen convenience over truth so completely that my theft became an inconvenience to a birthday dinner rather than a moral line. I remember the prosecutor nodding when I said, "The money can be replaced." What I need the court to understand is that this only happened because she believed our family name would protect her from the law. That, more than anything, felt like the center of the story. Restitution discussions began not long after. The amount was too large for Diane to cover quietly, and Lacey, of course, had nothing meaningful in her name besides debts, clothes, and fantasies. Diane ended up selling her SUV, cashing out a retirement account she had once bragged she'd never touch, and listing pieces of jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother's side of the family. I wish I could say I took pleasure in that. I didn't. What I felt was closer to recognition. For the first time, something valuable was leaving Diane's hands because of Lacey's choices, not mine. That was new. In our house, cost had always flowed one direction, toward me. Now the bill had finally found its proper address. The legal process also stripped away one of the biggest lies in the family, that Lacey was some misunderstood free spirit whose chaos was charming when framed correctly. She wasn't charming in a conference room with statements spread out. She wasn't charming when confronted with timestamps, device logs, and a deposit agreement for a studio financed with stolen money. She looked young, petty, frightened, small. The performance died when there was no one left to applaud it. Diane called me after one pretrial hearing and said, she didn't think it would go this far. I answered before I could stop myself. That's because you taught her nothing ever would. It was the first true thing I'd said directly to my mother in years, and neither of us could argue with it. Around the same time, I closed on a modest one-bedroom condo near the river. Not fancy, not huge, but clean and bright, and mine. I signed the final papers in navy scrubs because I had come straight from work after stabilizing a beagle in respiratory distress. The mortgage broker apologized for the fluorescent office. I almost laughed. Fluorescent offices built my entire adulthood. When I got the keys, I sat in my car and held them for a full minute before I turned the engine on. 3 years of saving. 3 weeks of hell. One door no one could use against me. I didn't tell my family the address. I didn't need to. Some endings are stronger when they don't know where you sleep. The last time I saw Diane before the preliminary hearing, she looked like a woman who had spent her whole life rearranging reality and had finally met a truth that wouldn't move. She asked me to meet at a diner halfway between my hospital and the courthouse. I almost said no, but Melissa told me one final conversation, public, brief, documented, might give me closure I couldn't get from legal language alone. Diane arrived early. No makeup, no jewelry, except her wedding band, no polished mother expression. Just a tired woman with a coffee she hadn't touched. For a minute we sat there in silence while waitresses moved around us and silverware clinked in the background. Then she said, "I kept thinking if I protected her long enough, she would become the person I kept promising everyone she was." That was the closest thing to honesty she had offered me in years. I asked her why that protection had always come at my expense. Why my labor, my savings, my peace, my dignity were always the first things offered up to keep Lacey comfortable. Diane cried quietly, not theatrically this time, and said something I had suspected since I was a child. "Because you looked strong." I almost smiled at the cruelty of that. Strong, the word people use when they mean convenient. The dependable daughter. The one who won't make us pay immediately. The one we can wound and still expect to answer the phone tomorrow. I was strong, I told her, because I had to be. Not because it didn't hurt. That landed. I could see it land. But understanding late is not the same thing as undoing damage. Diane asked if we could ever be a family again. I didn't give her the soft answer she wanted. I said maybe one day we could be two women who knew each other and told the truth. Family, as she and Lacey had practiced it, was over. Lacey took a plea deal 4 weeks later. No dramatic jury, no fiery speech from the gallery. Just a signed agreement, supervised probation, mandatory restitution, restricted financial access, and conditions tied to employment and counseling. Some people would call that too light. Maybe it was. But the real punishment had started long before that document. She lost the fantasy version of herself. She lost the mother-shaped shield that had stood between her and reality her entire life. She lost the luxury of being sloppy, pretty, and adored at the same time. Even more painful for her, I think, was that people stopped treating her recklessness like charm. Once the story left the family bubble and entered official records, her old tricks stopped working. She was no longer the spirited daughter. She was the woman who stole her sister's future and got caught. As for Diane, she was not sentenced in the same way, but she paid in other currencies: reputation, money, illusion. She had to explain to neighbors why police had been at the house, why her younger daughter was suddenly living with a friend from church for a while, why her SUV vanished, why she was picking up extra office shifts. Some relatives pulled away, some stayed and pretended none of it was that serious. That is how families survive shame, by dividing themselves into the honest and the loyal. I stopped trying to figure out which category anyone belonged to. It was none of my business once I stopped needing them to choose me. The night I moved into my condo, Hannah brought pizza and a cheap succulent plant with a little tag that said, "Roots don't have to hurt." We sat on the floor because I hadn't bought a couch yet. My dishes were still in boxes. My bedroom held one lamp, one comforter, and a stack of folded scrubs. It was perfect. Not because it was beautiful, but because nothing inside it was borrowed, stolen, or emotionally taxed. Everything there had been earned the hard way. Hannah asked whether I felt like I'd gotten revenge. I thought about that for a while. The police, the plea, the restitution, the house going quiet behind me. Not revenge, I said finally. More like accuracy. She laughed, but I meant it. Revenge sounds theatrical. What happened to my family was simpler and harsher. The truth finally matched the damage. So if you ask me what the lesson is, it isn't that you should always trust the law or always walk away or always forgive. It's this. The people who call you selfish for protecting yourself usually had a plan for continuing to use you. And once you understand that, everything changes. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is not scream, not beg, not explain until your throat breaks. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is document, decide, and let consequences introduce themselves. My mother defended my sister after she stole my 3 years of savings and kicked me out of the house. For most of my life, that would have been the end of the story. This time, it was only the part that forced the real ending to begin. And if you've ever been the person everyone leans on until your spine gives out, ask yourself one honest question. When was the last time anyone there protected you with the same loyalty they demanded from you? From my point of view, this story is a powerful reminder that the people closest to us can sometimes cause the deepest pain. But it also shows that betrayal does not have to define your future. Sometimes choosing self-respect, setting boundaries, and walking away from toxic behavior is the strongest form of healing. What touched me most is that real growth often begins when we stop begging for fairness and start protecting our peace. My name is Naomi Carter. I'm 28 years old, and the day my parents divided things fairly, they handed my brother the keys to a penthouse with skyline windows, private parking, and a concierge who knew his coffee order. Then they slid a thin envelope across the table to me like they were doing charity work. Inside was a deed to a cracked commercial parking lot behind an abandoned strip mall on the west side of Phoenix. A piece of asphalt so empty it still had faded arrows pointing nowhere. I stared at it, waiting for someone to explain the joke, and that's when my mother smiled over her wine glass and said, "Well, at least you can sleep under the stars." My father laughed. My brother laughed harder. I didn't, because that lot came with back taxes, weeds pushing through the concrete, and a chain-link fence bent open like even the neighborhood had given up on it. They weren't giving me an opportunity. They were handing me a burden and calling it character building. What they didn't know was that I had spent 6 years working in service bays, learning how customers are judged the second they pull up in a dented car, how working people get overcharged because no one thinks they'll question it, and how a space with enough pavement, water access, and stubbornness could become something worth more than any penthouse view. They thought they were leaving me with nothing. They had no idea that months later, the same people who laughed at me would be standing on that asphalt asking for a cut. Before I tell you what my brother said when he realized what I'd built, and what happened after I refused to hand him even 1 inch of it, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. The next morning, I drove to the lot before sunrise with a folding chair, a thermos of burnt coffee, and the kind of anger that makes you useful. In daylight, the place looked even worse. Cracked pavement, 2 dead light poles, trash wedged against the fence, and the shell of an old retail strip behind it with boarded windows and a roof line full of pigeons. But I also saw the things nobody in my family would ever bother noticing. The lot had street visibility, easy pull-in access, enough room for wash bays, and was close to delivery corridors, ride-share traffic, and 3 neighborhoods full of people who couldn't afford dealership prices. I didn't want another cafe, boutique, or cute weekend market. I wanted a business that fit the ground under it. I wanted something tough, something that worked. So I called Owen Brooks, the one friend I trusted to tell me the truth, even when it hurt. He'd known me since trade school and had watched me get passed over for promotions by men with softer hands and louder voices. When I told him I wanted to turn an empty parking lot into a women-led auto detailing and fleet care yard, a place where rideshare drivers, delivery contractors, nurses, teachers, and small business owners could get honest service without being talked down to, there was a long pause. Then he said, "That is either the smartest angry decision you've ever made, or the second smartest. Either way, I'm in." We spent that first week measuring the lot, sketching traffic flow, calling plumbers, pricing water reclamation mats, and hunting down used shade structures because Phoenix sun doesn't forgive bad planning. I used nearly all my savings on cleanup alone. Then the first setback hit. Zoning. The city wouldn't allow runoff into the storm system, which meant I needed drainage compliance, environmental controls, containment barriers, and a revised site plan. The estimate nearly choked me. A private contractor quoted a number so high I laughed in his face by accident, and he got offended like I was the rude one. The second setback came when a lender looked at my application, looked at me, and asked if there was a male operations partner he could discuss long-term execution with. I walked out before I said something expensive. That night, I sat in my car outside my apartment, gripping the steering wheel, wondering if my parents were right. Not about my worth, but about the world. Maybe they understood it perfectly. Maybe they knew some doors opened automatically for my brother and locked harder when I reached for them. But quitting would have made them profits, and I refused to hand them that victory. So I went smaller, smarter, meaner. I found a used pressure washing rig, negotiated a deferred payment on modular office containers, and started applying for workforce grants aimed at women entering skilled trades. I met Dana Whitmore at the permitting office after my third failed revision. She was brisk, unsentimental, and the only city official who talked to me like I had a future instead of a hobby. She circled 3 items on my site plan and said, "You're not far off. Stop trying to make this look pretty for people who won't save you. Make it legal. Make it durable. Then make it profitable." That sentence changed everything. So I did. I stopped pitching dreams and started building systems. Water containment, interior detailing lanes, shade coverage, fleet turnaround packages, subscription plans, a hiring model that trained women who'd been told all their lives to stay away from tools, grease, and money. Every time I got tired, I remembered my mother lifting her glass and telling me I could sleep under the stars. Fine, I thought. Then I'll build something under them. My brother, Grant Carter, found out what I was doing because my parents couldn't resist gossiping about me like I was a cautionary tale with a pulse. He called while I was hauling broken concrete into a rented dumpster, and the first thing he said was, "I heard you're opening a car wash on your little dirt kingdom." I looked down at my boots, covered in dust, and said, "It's not a car wash." He laughed. "Sure, and my penthouse is a treehouse." That was Grant's gift. He could make contempt sound casual, like cruelty was just another polished accessory. He worked in commercial real estate and moved through life like every room had already agreed to admire him. My parents adored that about him. To them, confidence mattered more than competence, and Grant had been overpraised for so long he thought applause was a birthright. A week later, they invited me to dinner to reconnect, which should have warned me. I showed up tired, sunburned, and still smelling faintly like degreaser, and walked straight into a performance. Grant had 2 friends there from his office, and before the salads even arrived, my father asked me, in that fake soft voice he used when he wanted an audience, "So how's the parking lot project?" Grant leaned back and said, "Dad, don't call it a project. Naomi is revolutionizing asphalt." Everyone laughed except me. Then my mother added, "We do worry about how this looks. You've always been so intense. Not hardworking, not determined, intense, the family word for difficult women who don't stay grateful." I should have left, but something inside me wanted them to hear themselves while I was still sitting there alive. So I asked, "How exactly does my business embarrass you more than giving one child a penthouse and the other a tax bill?" That shut the table up for a second. Then Grant smiled the way people do right before they stab you in a socially acceptable place. "Because I can maintain what I'm given," he said. "You turn everything into a fight." I walked out before dessert, but not before my mother called after me. "You always choose drama." That sentence stayed with me all week because it was the cleanest summary of family favoritism I had ever heard. The favored child gets to create damage and call it personality. The other child reacts to damage and gets called dramatic. Tell me that isn't true in more families than people want to admit. But humiliation is useful if you know what to do with it. The day after that dinner, I pitched my business at a local workforce development panel and nearly blew it. My voice shook. My slides froze. One committee member asked if there was enough demand for premium detailing, and I nearly said this was exactly why working people got ignored, because the second they weren't luxury clients, people assumed they didn't deserve quality. Instead, I took a breath and answered with numbers: rideshare volume, fleet turnover, service deserts, recurring packages, labor demand, and the training gap for women in skilled trades. I left that room convinced I had failed. 3 days later, I got the call. Partial grant approved. Not enough to make things easy, but enough to make them possible. Owen whooped so loudly I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Then came Victor Salazar, a retired mechanic with a reputation for honesty so strong half the neighborhood still called him before they bought a used car. He stopped by the lot one afternoon, watched me wrestle a hose line for 2 full minutes, and said, "You're doing that wrong." I told him he was welcome to keep walking. He grinned, took the hose, fixed my setup in 10 seconds, and stayed for 4 hours. Victor didn't do pity. He respected work. He became the first person outside Owen who looked at my lot and saw a business instead of a joke. By the end of that month, we had a name: Second Shift Auto Yard, because most of our first customers would be people whose real lives started after everyone else got home. Nurses after 12-hour shifts, delivery drivers at dusk, single moms on Saturdays, teachers during breaks, people who used their cars like lifelines. I hired my first 2 trainees, both women who had been told the auto world wasn't for them, and when they held their first polishers like they belonged there, I felt something crack open inside me. Not revenge. Not yet. Something better. Proof. Still, every good thing seemed to wake up new resistance. Materials got delayed. A supplier backed out after reconsidering the market. A portable office unit arrived with a broken lock. And then, the morning we were supposed to seal the wash pad, someone cut the temporary water line and left the valve running just enough to flood one section of the lot. Owen found it first. Could have been vandalism, he said. Could have been kids. Maybe, but I had spent my whole life around one particular kind of sabotage, the kind that arrives smiling later and asks how things are going. We opened on a brutal Saturday in late May with 3 shade canopies, 2 detailing lanes, 1 small office container, a hand-painted sign, and more fear than cash. But by 8 a.m., there were already 6 cars lined up at the gate. Victor had quietly called in favors, and the neighborhood showed up the way communities do when they sense somebody is trying to build something that belongs to them instead of extracting from them. A hospice nurse brought her SUV in caked with dust and dog hair and nearly cried when we got it clean enough that the interior smelled new again. A delivery driver signed up for monthly fleet service on the spot. A teacher asked if we offered weekend appointments because she couldn't miss school. By noon, the lot that had once looked abandoned sounded alive. Hoses spraying, vacuums humming, customers laughing beneath the shade, music coming from an old speaker Owen had zip-tied to a post because nothing on that site was elegant yet. But all of it was real. That was the first time I understood success doesn't always arrive with a dramatic soundtrack. Sometimes it sounds like people trusting you with something they use every day. Of course, that was exactly when Grant arrived. He came in a black SUV so polished it looked rented for a scene, and my parents stepped out behind him dressed like they were attending a fundraiser instead of my opening. My mother took one slow look around the lot and said, "Oh." Just that. One syllable loaded with disappointment, surprise, and irritation that I had made the place look legitimate. My father pretended to inspect the fence line like he was evaluating a tenant. Grant smiled at my customers before turning to me and saying, too loudly, "This is cuter than I expected." The woman at the check-in table heard him and rolled her eyes so hard I nearly laughed. "Why are you here?" I asked. My father answered first. "To support you." It was such an obvious lie that even he seemed embarrassed hearing it out loud. Then Grant added, "And to make sure you're not over your head. Liability on a place like this can get ugly fast." There it was. The warning disguised as concern. He walked the perimeter with my father, whispering, pointing, photographing things on his phone, and 15 minutes later, 2 code compliance officers rolled in. Not health inspectors this time, stormwater and site compliance. My stomach dropped so hard I felt it in my knees. The younger version of me would have panicked and handed my brother the exact collapse he came to witness. But Dana Whitmore had prepared me for this kind of moment. I had binders ready, permit copies, drainage maps, water containment logs, vendor receipts, waste disposal contracts. Before the officers could ask their second question, I was already handing them the relevant page. Victor stood near the lane entrance with his arms crossed like a human warning sign. Owen quietly redirected waiting customers and kept the line moving. Grant watched from near the gate, smug at first, then irritated, then increasingly still as the officers stopped finding problems. One of them even said, "Honestly, this is more organized than half the sites we see." My mother's mouth tightened. My father looked annoyed in a different way now, not because I was failing, but because I wasn't. When the officers left without a citation, several customers clapped, partly because they were relieved, and partly because everyone there had recognized a setup when they saw one. Grant muttered, "Don't get cocky." I stepped toward him and lowered my voice. "You should leave before this gets embarrassing." He smiled like he hadn't heard the threat under the sentence, but I saw it land. Then my mother did something that would have broken me a year earlier. She looked around at the women working my lanes. Women sweating, laughing, learning equipment, taking payments, moving with confidence, and said, "I still don't understand why you insist on doing everything the hard way." I looked at her and realized she truly meant it. In her world, value only counted if it came pre-approved by status, polished by men, and cushioned by inheritance. She couldn't understand why anyone would build from the ground up if they could spend their life trying to be chosen instead. "Because the easy way was never offered to me," I said, "and because some of us got tired of waiting to be respected." My father told me not to make a scene, which would have been funny if it weren't so predictable. Grant left with them, but not before stopping at the gate, turning back, and saying, "You know, this kind of thing only works until real investors notice the land." That line sat wrong in my head for hours. It wasn't mockery, it was interest. And when your golden child brother suddenly stops laughing at your asphalt and starts talking about land value, you learn to hear the difference. The first month after opening should have been the part where I finally breathed. Instead, it was where the real attack started. At first, it looked small. 2 anonymous one-star reviews posted the same afternoon, claiming our staff had stolen sunglasses from a glove compartment and scratched a luxury sedan. Then, a local neighborhood forum lit up with comments saying runoff from our site was probably contaminated. A man I'd never seen before came in demanding a refund for a service he couldn't prove he'd purchased. One customer showed me a blurry clip being shared online of an oily puddle near a curb with a caption naming my business, except the curb in the video wasn't even ours. The lies weren't random. They were coordinated just enough to feel organic, which meant somebody either knew what they were doing or had paid somebody who did. I called a team meeting in the office container that still smelled faintly of paint and summer heat. My staff looked scared, angry, and insulted in that particular way people do when they've worked hard and are being recast as dishonest by strangers. Owen wanted to go after the accounts publicly. Victor wanted to find whoever started it and introduce them to old-school consequences. I wanted proof. Because accusations thrown upward at privileged people bounce off. Proof, timed correctly, can crack the whole mask. So we started documenting everything: customer intake photos, vehicle condition videos, security timestamps, water testing logs, payment records, every bay, every car, every complaint. Then Dana called me from the city. Her voice was flat in the way professionals get when they already know something is rotten. "We received an anonymous packet alleging unpermitted chemical disposal and unsafe employment practices," she said. "I'm not saying panic. I am saying be ready." Anonymous packet. The wording alone sounded expensive. That night, I barely slept. I sat at my kitchen table scrolling the fake reviews, reading lines clearly written by people who had never set foot on my lot, and a memory came back so hard it felt physical. Being 13. Overhearing my parents tell relatives that Grant was naturally exceptional, while I was resilient. At the time, I thought resilience was praise. It took me years to understand it was the family label for the child expected to survive neglect without making anyone uncomfortable. The next morning, I checked the office camera feeds again and found something interesting. 2 nights earlier, a silver sedan had pulled up outside the side fence. A man got out, photographed the drainage area, then slipped an envelope under our office door. We found the envelope in the footage because one of my trainees had accidentally kicked it aside the next morning. Inside, it was a glossy brochure from Grant's firm about urban redevelopment opportunities, with one sentence circled in pen: underused commercial surfaces can be transformed through strategic acquisition. No signature, no note, just pressure. As if he was reminding me that the family joke parcel had become land he now wanted back under his kind of control. That same week, my mother called. Not to ask how I was holding up, but to tell me I was being combative, and that I should consider bringing Grant in, on the business side, before my small operation got too complicated. There it was. The whole plan, finally visible. Laugh at me while the lot was worthless. Undermine me once it had customers, then re-enter as savior, strategist, owner. I told her no so quietly it seemed to unsettle her more than yelling would have, but I still needed to stop the bleeding because pride doesn't pay payroll. So instead of hiding from the rumors, I went louder. We announced Open Yard Saturday. Free car seat sanitation checks, discounted rideshare packages, live demos on paint correction, and a women in trades workshop where high school girls could try tools, ask questions, and see what skill looked like up close. If someone wanted to paint us as shady, I'd flood the place with visibility. And if you've ever had someone try to rewrite who you are, you know why public truth matters. Not because strangers should define you, but because silence lets liars rent space in your life. By the time the event flyer went live, registrations jumped, the community chamber reposted us, and a regional courier company asked to stop by and evaluate our fleet turnaround process. That was the kind of contract that could stabilize the whole business, which, of course, meant Grant would move next. He did it the morning of Open Yard Saturday. Not in secret, not through a burner account. He showed up in person, wearing a pale suit like he was about to host a panel discussion on my ruin, with my parents beside him, and a man in a navy blazer I recognized from his firm's website, a development investor named Richard Bell. The lot was already filling with customers, students, local press, and community partners when Grant walked straight into the center lane and said, "Naomi, we need to discuss the future of this property like adults." Conversations around us thinned. Cameras turned. He knew exactly what he was doing. Public pressure, social theater. The investor stood back, studying the site with predatory calm, like he was already imagining my business scraped off the map and replaced with rentable glass. I told Grant this wasn't the time. He smiled. "Actually, it's perfect. Dad and I have been reviewing the deed structure, and we think this land would perform better under professional management. We're prepared to offer you a role if you transfer operating control before the city issues enforcement actions." My mother jumped in before I could answer. "This is generous, Naomi. Please don't be emotional." There's something almost supernatural about how quickly some parents can revert to the script that kept one child small for decades. In one sentence, she had dismissed my work, anticipated my resistance, and framed my refusal as instability. The old me might have exploded right there. But I had spent too many months learning systems to collapse into theirs. So I asked, loud enough for the crowd to hear, "What enforcement actions?" Grant shrugged as if the answer were obvious. "The ones coming after the inspection. You knew this wouldn't last." That was the moment Dana Whitmore stepped through the gate with 2 city officers and a clipboard. The timing would have looked scripted if life were kinder. Instead, it was just perfect. The lot went quiet. Dana nodded to me, then to Grant, and said, "Actually, Mr. Carter, since you're here, this may be useful." One of the officers carried a sealed evidence bag. My heart started pounding, not from fear, but from recognition. They had found something. Dana turned to me first. "We reviewed the anonymous complaint file, the runoff allegation, and the footage you submitted. We also subpoenaed nearby camera angles from the adjacent tire shop. Grant's smile didn't vanish all at once. It frayed. Those videos show a vehicle registered to a holding company linked to your firm entering the site after hours on 3 occasions, she said to him. One visit involved tampering with water controls. Another involved placement of petroleum-stained absorbent pads near the runoff zone. The third involved staged photography later used in a false online complaint. Richard Bell, the investor, took one step away from Grant like contamination traveled fast. My father opened his mouth, closed it, then tried indignation. This is ridiculous. Dana didn't even look at him. In addition, payment records tied to a marketing contractor show coordinated review activity against this business within hours of those site visits. That part came from Owen, who had done more than calm me down the past month. He had tracked usernames, timestamps, and billing entities, then handed everything to a lawyer friend willing to help, because his wife used our services and was furious on my behalf. Grant tried the obvious move next. You can't prove I authorized anything. Victor, who had been standing near the demonstration area all along, lifted a tablet and said, "That's why I saved the voicemail." The whole crowd turned. Victor hit play. Grant's voice came through clear as desert light. "I don't need it shut down forever. I just need it unstable long enough for her to take the offer." The silence after that recording was violent. My mother's face went white. My father looked at Grant not with guilt, but with offended disbelief, as if the problem were not what his son had done, but that he had done it sloppily enough to get caught. Richard Bell took off his sunglasses and said coldly, "Our firm won't be involved in anything connected to this." Then he walked out. The local reporter near the gate didn't just write that down, she recorded it. Grant tried one last laugh, but it came out thin and strange. "She set this up." I stepped toward him for the first time all morning. "No," I said. "You just never learned that people who build from scratch keep receipts." Then Dana informed him that a formal referral was being made for property tampering, fraudulent complaint activity, and interference with a permitted commercial site. He wasn't handcuffed on the spot. Real life is often less cinematic than people want. But he was publicly finished. And sometimes that lands harder. My mother actually reached for my arm then, as if family could be pulled back on like a coat when the weather changed. "Naomi, please," she whispered, suddenly soft, suddenly human, suddenly afraid of standing on the wrong side of the story. I stepped back. "You laughed when you handed me this lot," I said, not shouting, which somehow made it cut deeper. "You called me emotional every time I defended myself. You taught him he could take from me as long as he smiled while doing it." Nobody around us moved. Not my staff, not the customers, not the girls holding workshop packets under the shade tent. Everybody heard it. My father told me not to say things I'd regret. I almost smiled. That advice is about 20 years late. Then I turned my back on all 3 of them and walked to the front of the lot, where customers were still waiting, cameras still rolling, and my actual business, still needed to run. "Open the demo lane," I said. "We're not losing today." And we didn't. Not even close. What happened after that was better than revenge in the childish sense, because it lasted longer and cost more. Grant's firm suspended him within 48 hours. The investor backed out of 2 pending deals. The local business paper picked up the story. Then a Phoenix news segment ran a piece on women in trades that used my lot as the centerpiece, and mentioned the sabotage attempt without even needing to say my family's last name twice. Public shame does what private guilt rarely can. It forces consequences on people who thought charm was insurance. The fake reviews were removed. The complaint file collapsed. The courier company signed a 6-month fleet contract with us after watching how we handled pressure. Open Yard Saturday brought in more customers than our first 3 weekends combined, and 2 parents from the workshop asked if I would ever consider creating a paid training track for young women who wanted hands-on skills without drowning in student debt. I said yes before they finished the question. 3 months later, Second Shift Auto Yard expanded into a structured evening apprenticeship program. 6 months after that, we added a second service lane and mobile fleet units. A year later, the lot my parents had mocked as a place to sleep under the stars was lit every evening by work lamps, compressor lights, and the glow of women getting good at things the world once told them not to touch. As for my parents, they didn't apologize right away. People like that usually need reality to invoice them more than once. My father lost credibility in circles where reputation was currency. My mother discovered that social friends who love confidence do not love scandal. Then came the final twist I had not expected but should have. Grant's penthouse had been partially financed through a chain of family guarantees and leveraged assets tied to deals now under stress. The polished symbol of favoritism turned out to be exactly what it had always been: expensive theater. When one project collapsed and another stalled, the carrying costs started to hurt. That was when they came to me, not to repair the past, not to ask what I needed. They came to my office container, which had since been renovated into a real glass front operations room overlooking the lot, and my mother cried before she sat down. My father tried dignity first. Grant tried silence. Then, finally, the truth. They wanted in. A licensing arrangement. A family holding company. Expansion money for all of us. My brother, said maybe the brand could scale faster if we worked together. I looked at the 3 people who had spent years confusing access with love and entitlement with leadership, and I understood something so clearly it felt peaceful. They didn't miss me. They missed my usefulness. That is not the same thing, and too many people ruin their futures by pretending otherwise. So I told them no. No partnership, no equity, no advisory role, no family umbrella. I said the only contribution I would accept from them was a donation, with no naming rights and no control, to a scholarship fund for women entering skilled trades. My father called that vindictive. I called it boundaries with paperwork. Grant finally snapped then, saying I was punishing them. I held his gaze and answered, "No, I'm just refusing to rescue the people who laughed while I was drowning." My mother asked if there was any path back. There was, but not the one she wanted. I told her, accountability is not a speech in private after the damage stops paying off. Accountability is changed behavior that costs you something. Accountability is telling the truth when lying would protect your image. Accountability is admitting, out loud, that favoritism doesn't just wound the child who gets less. It also deforms the child who gets too much and teaches an entire family to confuse imbalance with love. A week later, to my surprise, my parents attended our apprenticeship graduation. They sat in the back. They clapped when the trainees crossed the lot to receive certificates under the lights. My father looked old. My mother looked smaller than I remembered. Grant didn't come. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he wouldn't. At the end of the ceremony, I stood in front of our newest class and looked out across the same asphalt I'd once been expected to treat as a curse. This place, I told them, exists because nobody handed us the easy version. And that hurts, until the day you realize building your own foundation also means nobody gets to pull it out from under you. That, to me, is the real lesson. Success is not best measured by the people you defeat. It's measured by what you build that keeps helping others long after your anger has cooled. My parents gave my brother a penthouse and left me an empty parking lot. They thought one looked like love and the other looked like loss. But the penthouse was a gift that made him dependent on being favored. The lot was a burden that forced me to become capable. In the end, they came back, begging to share what grew there. And I finally understood the one thing neglected children learn too late. Being underestimated can become an advantage the moment you stop asking the people who hurt you to recognize your value. So tell me honestly, if your family laughed while handing you less, would you ever let them back in once you turned it into everything? My personal view is that the villains in this story are especially disturbing because they feel so realistic. Naomi's parents are not just cruel, they normalize favoritism and treat emotional neglect like good parenting. In my opinion, that makes them even more damaging because they don't just hurt one child. They also raise Grant to believe entitlement is normal. Grant, meanwhile, is the kind of villain many people recognize in real life: polished, arrogant, manipulative, and confident that family privilege will protect him from consequences. Have you ever seen someone become selfish or arrogant because their family always excused their behavior? And do you think favoritism can quietly destroy an entire family over time?